So far we've talked about the kinds of chords we find in classical music and also how to voice them. In a few videos from now, we're going to talk about voice leading. And so we should talk about then the kinds of harmonic progressions we find. So you can say, okay, I see all these chords, and in some ways there aren't a lot of chords to work with, right? Because we don't have all 13 and 11 chords, and we don't have, lots of other chords you might be familiar with. But where do I start? What chord do I start on? What chord do I end on? What if I start on one chord, how can I go to another chord? Which chords can I go to? Yeah, and that's a question of, what kind of harmonic progressions do we find in classical music? Now, the chart you see in front of you here is a kind of chart that you'll find in many textbooks. Some version of this you'll find in most textbooks on tonal harmony. So maybe it's a bit like reading tea leaves if you've never seen it before. What does all this mean? Well, you can see that most arrows are pointing to the right, and there's one arrow that's dotted and is pointing to the left. So let's talk about what all that might mean. Okay, so the dotted arrow means that this chord, the thing that's circled, which is the one chord, can go to any of these other chords. So that's the first thing to understand. The one chord can go to any chord. All of these just point in the direction of the next chord that they go to. And notice that they all lead back to the one chord. Okay, so this already tells us something about harmonic progression in classical music. The first is this. Any harmonic progression almost always starts with a root position 1 chord, and then it can go to any of these other chords. The goal is always the root position 1 chord, and this is usually preceded, as we see here, by a 5 chord, and that 5 chord is usually in root position as well, just so that you know, it's usually in root position. So this 5 would go to here, and of course this 1 could go back to 5, which would then bring you back to 1, which could then go back to 5, which could go back to 1. It sounds like a silly harmonic progression. It's very simple, but you find it all over the place in classical music. Let's also look at some other things. Some of you are familiar with the circle of fifths progression, where we'll go down or up by fifths to the next chord. In this case, we're going down, right? So we start on the 1 chord, and we go down a fifth, we get the 4 chord. And then we go down a fifth, we get the 7 diminished chord, and we go down a fifth, we get the 3 chord, then the 6 chord, we go down a fifth, we get the 2 chord, we go down a fifth, we get the 5 chord, and then of course the 5 chord brings us back to 1. Okay, so the circle of fifths is a fundamental part of harmonic progression in classical music. We also see in these two very clearly that substitution is possible. So why are these two chords together in a box and as well here? Well, it's because these chords can actually substitute for each other. You can think of the 2 chord as a substitute for the 4 chord. You can also see the 7 diminished chord as a substitute for the 5 chord. And some of you may be familiar with the terminology of tonic, which is the 1 chord, subdominant, which is the 4 chord, and dominant, which is the 5 chord. But in terms of functions, we can look at a subdominant chord being either the 4 chord or the 2 chord, and a dominant chord being either a 5 chord, 7 diminished. That is, we call this the dominant chord, but a dominant function in harmony can be expressed by either of these two. So they can act as substitutes. So the idea of substitution in classical music is an important one as well. And we're going to find that substitution happens both diatonically, that is inside of the key, as well as chromatically, outside of the key. Let's look then at some of the most basic harmonic progressions that we find in classical music. I mean, it looks very extensive, but I put these in brackets simply to say that usually when you go to these, you're going to them because you're starting a circle of fifths progression. More commonly, you just stay sort of with these this collection of chords here. So the 6th chord and then 4, 2, 5, 7 diminished, and 1. So very common progression in classical music. 1 goes to 5, and 5, of course, wants to go back to 1. So it goes back to 1. Or we have the 1, which goes to 4. 4 leads back to 5. 5 goes back to 1. This is actually less common in classical music than using the substitute of it, which we'll talk about when we get to it, but I'll just explain very briefly. 1 going not to 4, but to 2, then going to 5, then going to 1. And of course, a very sort of reduced version of the circle of fifths progression. 1 going to 6, going to 2, going to 5, going to 1. And anybody who's ever played, 50s pop tunes knows that this is a very important harmonic progression for that era. And it also can be found in classical music. It's the texture and the style is completely different, but the progression is nonetheless frequently there.